simultaneously very much alive, while also looking like it's maintained some damage. Maybe it got hit by lightning, maybe it had some other kind of injury. So Boisseau makes this tree feel iconic and very much majestic, but its majesty and its power come from its imperfections and its ability to sustain trauma and overcome it. So this tree was made with ink and brush on toned paper. I toned the sketchbook page using watered down indie ink, which actually made it a little bit too dark to make the preliminary drawing with a pencil. So in this case, I'm doing the preliminary drawing using my lightest ballpoint pen. And because this time around I'm beginning with a ballpoint pen, I'm much more careful and deliberate than I was while doing the Rembrandt copy. So this underdrawing is much less loose and sketchy. I'm measuring a lot more. I'm making sure that I have enough information on the page that the drawing doesn't wind up outgrowing the piece of paper I'm working on. I'm trying to make sure that the branches are proportional to the trunk, and I'm not going to be going into all of the teeny tiny details with my ballpoint pen. I'm just taking a little bit of time to indicate the shape of the tree, map out its major landmarks, and use these landmarks when I begin working with brush and ink. So I'm going to be using the same India ink that I used to tone the paper, and at least initially I'm going to be watering it down quite a lot as well. So I'm starting light with ink for the same reasons that I started as light as I could with ballpoint pen. And that's because it's easy to get darker and tighter as you work, and actually very difficult to get lighter and looser. So start in the shadows, start as light as you can, and build up your dark slowly. So I'm only using 2 brushes to work on this tree, but both of them are really, really good brushes. So the first is a Da Vinci Maestro travel brush, and it's a size 7. And the second is a Da Vinci Maestro non-travel brush, so it doesn't fold up, and that's a size 4. So once I've loosely indicated where my shadows are going to be, I'm going to get out a little bit of white gouache and indicate my highest highlights as well. And having those 2 things, your shadows and your highest highlight, is what's going to help you see the entire range of midtones in between. So the wonderful thing about working on toned paper is that if you let the tone of the paper serve as your midtone, that tone will wind up doing an enormous amount of work for you. So when you're working on white paper and you can only get darker, you have to work out every single midtone and every single gradation. On toned paper, you've already got all of your midtones because you're going to let the tone of the paper do the work for you. And all you're going to need to work out are the shadows, which are going to be darker than your midtone, and the highlights, which are going to be lighter than your midtone. And by the way, the old masters almost never worked on white paper, and partially it was because white paper was expensive and hard to come by, but also because working on toned paper, working on a midtone, feels more organic and more intuitive. And frankly, a lot of people find it easier. So it's easier, it frequently allows you to work faster, especially if you're working from life, and it tends to feel good. And just because it's easier, just because it feels good, doesn't mean that it's somehow less worthwhile than something that's harder and more time consuming. Making art shouldn't feel like an uphill battle all the time. If it's easy, if it's fun, you'll wind up doing more of it, and chances are you'll wind up getting better at doing what you do. So if you're new to working on toned paper, the most difficult part of this for you is actually going to be not covering the entire paper with either something dark or something light. Being able to leave the tone of your paper as your midtone and letting your drawing breathe. And that's just because we're used to drawing and painting on white paper. And on white paper, leaving areas untouched entirely can make the drawing look unfinished. Whereas on toned paper, it helps your drawing look more alive. So if you look carefully at what Jean-Jacques Boisseau is doing, he's doing just that. He's leaving the midtones in the middle of the tree as the tone of the paper, using light layers of ink to build up the shadows on the right side of the tree, and saving his highlights for the left part of the tree where the light is hitting the trunk. So you can alternate between the lights and darks, building both up slowly and kind of helping the tree emerge from the page. So you'll probably notice that when you apply your black ink, it's going to dry pretty much the same value as what you apply. So if you've diluted it to a light gray, it's probably going to dry a light gray. If you didn't dilute it at all and it's pretty much a deep black, it's going to dry a deep black. However, when you're working with white gouache, you'll notice that you'll apply it, it'll probably look like a pretty bright white. And then after a minute or two, it'll dry about 2 to 3 shades darker than the way that you applied it initially. And that's just a quality that gouache has. It dries a few shades darker than the way that you apply it. Once you've had a little bit of experience with it, your eye will almost start to adjust for it. And you'll either end up using a brighter white to begin with, adjusting for the fact that it's going to dry a few shades darker. Or if you want really bright luminous highlights, you're going to build them up in several layers. And my recommendation is start by watering the gouache down quite a bit and then build up slowly using progressively less water as you go along. So this slows you down, it prevents you from getting too bright and too opaque too quickly, and helps you see more values within the lights. So you can switch between your dark ink and your white gouache as many times as you want. You can build up your lights, get them as bright as you want, and then go back into the shadows with your ink. Take a look at your core shadow and maybe reiterate that. Figure out where you want your darkest and most dramatic darks to be, and use progressively less and less diluted ink to build up your darks. So this technique is all about pushing and pulling. So you push your darks down, you pull your lights up, and you constantly reevaluate what they look like in relation to each other. So you'll notice that I started with the trunk of the tree, and that as of right now, I've barely touched the foliage at all. And I believe that that is what Boisseau did as well when he was working on this. So when I look at an old master drawing, one of the things that I'm trying to figure out is, where did their attention go? What were they concentrating on? What were they struggling with? What did they have the most fun with? And I think what caught his attention is this weird twisty form of the tree. The ways that the light hits it and the ways that it splinters on top and then reaches up into the sky. And I think that's what he spends the most time rendering. And if you look at his foliage, it looks very light, very airy, and completely unfussy. So I think once he's got the trunk the way that he wants it, he looks at the basic shape of the foliage, puts down some very, very light, very transparent ink washes to indicate the shapes of where the leaves are going to be. And these washes are so light that they're basically a slightly darker midtone, just a shade or two darker than the tone of the paper. And then he takes a very fine brush with a good point, mixes up some darker ink, and then picks out where the edges of the leaves are going to be. So he's not really going into kind of the middle of that cluster of leaves, he's just letting it breathe. What he's looking at is the edges of those clusters of leaves as they're silhouetted against the sky. And while he's observing the form carefully, he's actually stylizing the leaves. I don't think he's observing every single one. So what he winds up with is this kind of beautiful calligraphy for both the leaves and these fine branches that are spreading from the trunk and into the foliage. So when it comes to the foliage, he's trying to figure out what's essential and what's not. And what's essential for him is not painting every single leaf exactly the way he sees it in the tree that's in front of him. The general shape of the foliage is essential. Keeping it transparent for him is also essential, because I think he wants to create the feeling that air and light is coming through the leaves and for that he can't let the leaves get too dark and opaque. I think he spends a lot of time very carefully observing these dark branches reaching up through the foliage. And that's because the trunk and the branches, no matter how fine they get, they're still the skeleton of the tree. And that's because without that skeleton, without that structure, the foliage would just wind up looking like a bunch of amorphous blobs. So he reserves most of the white, most of the highlights for this tree for the trunk and the branches as well. But there's a few of these beautiful little moments where the light hits the leaves. And it happens here in this cluster of leaves towards the bottom, a little bit up top. And then there's a tiny bit of very bright light in the grass all the way in the foreground. And this little bit of light goes such a long way. These highlights are pretty sparse, they're very economical, and yet they make an enormous amount of difference. They make the clusters of leaves affected by that light come forward at you. They make it look much more three-dimensional and much more alive. Alright, so by now I've spent several hours with Jean-Jacques Boisseau and his blasted tree, and I feel like I got to know this tree pretty well. So I love this tree. I feel like it's an honor to have had some time trying to figure out how to recreate it. And by now I'm just having fun with it. So I'm looking very closely at the original drawing, and I'm making a series of minute adjustments to my own tree. So because this ink is permanent, as long as I didn't get too dark in the foliage, I can adjust it and make it a little bit darker just by applying another light ink wash on top of what I already have. I can look closely at that calligraphy at the edges of his leaves and just kind of let myself relax into the details for a while. So yeah, thank you for watching and listening, everyone. Over the course of the next week, find a tree drawings that you love, find an artist that you want to spend time with, and then do either a drawing on white paper, something on toned paper, or if you possibly have time for it, then both. Alright, thank you everyone.